Hi, and thank you for joining the webinar on third-party risk management with Pret A Manger. My name is Angela Abogu from Northdoor. On the webinar today, we have Darren Craig, RiskXchange CEO. He'll be talking us through third-party risk management best practices. And our guest speaker today is Alan Cain, Global Information Security Officer at Pret A Manger. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them through and we'll pick these up at the end of the presentation. Darren, would you like to start with best practices?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. So this webinar is going to talk about specifically third-party risk and how to manage third-party risk. But I'm sure it's not surprising to everyone on the call or webinar that cybersecurity or cyber loss is a huge problem. And you know, independent research has shown that it's going to continue that way, with some massive losses between now and 2021. And I think the trend is increasing. Certainly spending is increasing year on year, probably around 10 to 12% spending increase. But what's interesting, you know, when you start to break down the challenge of cybersecurity and start to look at where the real problems lie, you know, for years, many years now, companies have focused on perimeter security and securing the castle, so to speak, and building the moat and the perimeter. But what they've sort of neglected to look at, and to some extent, is the third-party risk or vendor risk management, as it's commonly known. And Deloitte have a pretty good study, which came out in 2019, which highlights some of this underinvestment within this particular space within the cybersecurity industry. So again, I think this reflects what we're seeing. There's an awful lot of breaches nowadays. The numbers, you know, some analysts say that 60% of breaches nowadays are caused by a third party. So it's a huge number. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take you through the sort of building blocks, if you like, of a VRM program or vendor risk management program. And we're going to identify and analyze risk factors, how to rank your third parties, how to map out assessment types, and talk about how you should establish the vendor risk management function within a business, which isn't a common thing, unfortunately. We'll also talk about some of the controls and how to define some of those controls, as well as establishing mitigation and reporting, which is a critical part of any program. And then establishing the third-party relationships to help facilitate fourth-party risk and in some cases fifth-party risk. So again, this is an evolving area of risk that hasn't been looked at previously. And then we'll wrap up with talking a little bit about using contracts to try and manage some of that risk and mitigate risk, and also how to try and show or push down some accountability, if you like, in terms of risk down into your fourth and fifth parties. As Anja says, I'm very kindly joined by Alan today. So I'm going to take you through some of the content, and Alan will interject, and I'll have a bit of a discussion around each of the topics. But as Angela has already said, if you have any questions, feel free to pop those into the Q&A box or button on your screen, and we'll get to those at the end. So one of the very first things you need to think about is are you wasting resources on the wrong security assessments? We see this a lot when we go into clients, and you know, especially when they're just starting out to look at vendor risk, and they tend to say, okay, so we have 500 suppliers or 1,000 suppliers, in some cases tens of thousands of suppliers, and they start to say, well, how are we ever going to manage that risk? How are we going to map out assessments for all of these third parties? But the important thing to remember here is not all the risks are critical to the business, so it's important to map those out and understand what is the real risk to the organization? You know, is it proprietary information? Is it financial data? Is it maybe PII data, which is obviously a key requirement for GDPR these days? Or is it some sort of other third-party data or intellectual property data? Is there any strategic information in there maybe that would be at risk? So again, it's important to look at the risk, the risk factors, if you like, and the types of information that you're processing with a third party. Alan, any thoughts on this?
Morning. Yeah, so you're right. So once you've kind of you found out what data you have, especially those that process PII and PCI data, which, to be fair, you should already know because you would have done your GDPR audits. You can then help suppliers by giving them targeted questionnaires, which allows them to stop wasting time, because I guarantee this call has had those questionnaires where you've got hundreds and hundreds of questions, and most of the answers are non-applicable. You know, I've been through many a spreadsheet, and it just wastes your time and theirs. So this allows you to have all your suppliers narrowed down to the critical ones, and then getting exactly the right information for them to answer for you.
Great piece of advice. Thanks, Alan. So it's important to, when you start to do this, it's really, really important to try and be specific as possible. And also, look at the interactions you have between your third parties and the dependencies you may have within your third party or fourth party, in some cases, supply chain. The next thing you need to think about once you've carried out the work looking at the types of information is what damage can be caused if this third party had a breach or this fourth party had a breach. This is an interesting angle to come from. Traditionally, most companies said, "Oh, we have a framework. We need to assess all of our suppliers against a particular framework. Maybe that's your own security policy, or maybe it's a standard like ISO 27001, or maybe some of the other standards like PCI, for example." But it's also important, and I think maybe more important, to really sit down and understand what damage can this third party do. Will they cause reputational damage to the brand? Will they cause the company to face financial penalties, maybe from a regulator because of a GDPR issue? Could they cause litigation possibilities from maybe data subjects, for example, or an individual? Would it have negative shareholder reaction, for example, if there was a breach? And we've seen it so many times nowadays that share prices drop considerably once there's the breach. We track a lot of this within RiskXchange, and we commonly see share price drops of anywhere between 5 and 25%. Now, in some cases that does recover, of course, but we certainly have seen cases where it hasn't recovered, and this obviously has a net value impact on the business itself. Alan, any thoughts around this particular area from Pret's point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, brand is everything to Pret, as I'm sure it is to all of our listeners here. But so protecting the brand is key to the business. So if you imagine, I don't know if anyone's been into a Pret lately, but you'll see these digital wallboards where you can go up to them and select what food you want and then see all the ingredients, etc. They're really quite cool and interactive. But now you imagine that third party had a breach, and the malicious actor then posts images on there, messages, that could then affect the brand because everyone's going to see them. And the worst thing, you could have was obscene images being posted across the entire business. So that's why the continual monitoring piece is absolutely key. And a bit later on, we'll touch on an actual incident where that continual monitoring part actually helped us resolve an issue with a third party.
Okay, great, excellent. So the next stage then really to build out your VRM program is to start and rank your third parties. So at this stage, you've sort of looked at the types of information your third parties are processing or handling on your behalf, or the organization's behalf. Then you've also mapped out in terms of the damage that a third party can do if they had a breach, and that's the key question to ask yourself: what happens if this third party had a breach? And now you're starting to get a bit more of a handle, I guess, on who are the risky third parties and who are the ones that are maybe not so at risk. And we would suggest that you start to rank these third parties into tiering. The most common tiering that we implement as part of a risk exchange program is we implement tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and in some cases tier 4, depending on the scope of your program itself. But obviously, I think it speaks for itself that tier 1 is your most riskiest or critical third parties, and really that information can be gleaned from the previous exercises you've carried out with your teams within the business, and also the third parties themselves. So the next thing is really to start to rank them into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and maybe, as I said, tier 4. Alan, what's your thoughts around this? Do you guys rank your suppliers?
Yeah, so I've actually found the best way to do this is by creating groups. It's an overlooked thing within a lot of tools where ownership of supplier relationships isn't addressed. So what you can have in RiskXchange, you can have a group where you have an owner for that group, and then you put all their relationship in there. So their suppliers are all in one group. That then gives them an overall score. And then you can then report on that to the board when you do your monthly security reports or whatever, but it gives ownership, and that's the key.
So Alan, can you give us an example of groups within Pret?
Yep, so we've got HR group, payroll group, PCI suppliers, recruitment, and even facilities, which is quite overlooked as well, because there are third parties. They could be single individuals, for instance, someone that comes and changes a lock. It's going to have all their details in it as well. So you need to be able to, assess the risk of all these third parties. So
yeah.
The key part of it is assigning responsibility, and once that relationship owner takes responsibility, you're laughing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was just going to mention that actually. So it's really important that you delegate the authority and responsibility down into the different parts of the business. Everyone knows, I'm sure on the call today, it can be challenging to get investment for cybersecurity. Surprisingly, it's still challenging nowadays. But it's important that it's not only the problem of the IT team or the security team. It's important for everybody within the business. So I think what Alan's just explained there is a good way to delegate that responsibility down into the various teams or departments, if you like. So making marketing responsible for all of their third parties and holding them accountable, I guess, to monitoring their risk score and making sure that it's maintained. So the other thing then is once you've started to you've mapped out the risk and understand your tiering, is you need to start to think about your assessment methods and how you go about assessing these third parties. There's a number of factors really comes into play here. It's important to understand the financial cost to run this program and map out the third parties, as well as the time invested and the employees needed. These things tend to be forgotten about in some cases where we see the programs being built out. They maybe make a lot of assumptions that they can run this program with one person, maybe part-time in some cases. And unfortunately, that's very far from the truth, particularly when you have hundreds and hundreds of suppliers. Now, previously I've said you can share some of that responsibility with the different departments, which is a great way to level out that investment case. But it's important to try to understand the amount of time required to assess these third parties, particularly when it comes to if you were using manual questionnaires effectively. These questionnaires can take a lot of time. It's not just the time to send out the questionnaire, it's also the time to follow up and get a response. And then depending on your questionnaire, you may be asking for various pieces of information to provide some validation, which is an important part, obviously. But unfortunately, that requires more time and more people. And it can be hard to see where you get the time to review all of the answers you've got in, or review all of the documentation. and that program can take, elapsed time could be considerable. So it's important to map out these things to try and understand what investments you need for your program itself. Alan, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Darren. I mean, when I first started at Pret, we done an assessment for GDPR, etc., where we had all our suppliers, we looked at all of them, and we had a questionnaire, which to be fair, I'd used for quite some time, and I was quite proud of it, to be fair, because I had some really good questions on there. But we started sending them out, and then we started getting them back, which was great. However, the time it took me to read these was ridiculous, and a lot of it was non-applicable. So the ability to create custom questionnaires is key, because then you can actually target the questions you need for that supplier. And as we said before, it stops them wasting time, stops you wasting time, etc. But also, it allows them to upload documents. So documents they've got for processes, certifications, contracts, even all up into RiskXchange. So you have everything in one place. And to me, that's one place to find all your contact information, all your contract is a great thing. How many times have we all been looking through a shared drive, looking for a contract, or something like that? It just saves so much time for everybody.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. It's, again, we have seen previous organizations use previous programs where they tried to assess their third parties using a particular framework or standard. And if you take maybe ISO 27001 as your framework, your baseline, that's going to require a lot of questions, many hundreds in some cases, and that doesn't necessarily fit every supplier. So again, it's important to map the right assessments to the right third parties. In supply chains, you tend to see quite a mixed, diverse range of companies. Some very, very small, providing niche services or products to an organization, and some very large. So it's really important to try not to approach it with a one size fit all. And as Alan says, there's, if you can customize that assessment in some way to align it better with the type of third party, then that's a better path to take. So after you've ranked your third parties, it's important then to start mapping those assessments to your third parties. And one of the ways you can start to help that assessment process, I guess, is to add continuous monitoring. So I think, Alan, I'm sure you have something to say around this point, but what we see a lot is companies that have built custom assessments, and they have then sort of reinforced those custom assessments with continuous monitoring. Because the challenge with what sort of point-in-time assessments is they're often outdated, and they don't take into account changes in the third party. In most cases, what you see is an assessment is completely out of date the day it's sent back to you. And it really doesn't give you any insight in terms of the risk going forward or in between those assessment cycles. So most assessment cycles we see are 12 monthly or annually. So again, what happens in between times? What happens if the third party is breached in between the next time the assessment? So it's important to realize that everything's dynamic. Environments are changing every day. And unfortunately, assessments or questionnaires or surveys, whatever phrase you like to use, are really not really fit for purpose anymore. It's important to back this up with some form of continuous monitoring. And that allows you then to keep an eye on what the supply chain's doing and if there's any risks come up. Alan, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so after you got your third parties and you know who your say your final 3-4 are, the way Pret have done it is that we've embedded RiskXchange into our procurement process. So what they'll do, they'll come up and they'll say, here's our final set of suppliers. Can be put through RiskXchange, we'll get a score from that. So that will then give us a baseline score. They'll then complete the questionnaires. That will then give us a score. So then from that, they could have done all the financial checks already, but this allows them to then have more confidence with the third party they're going to go with. But because this is continually being monitored, you can then add that into the contract. So you can say if the score ever goes below 600, we need to have a chat. And a lot of the time, that's when you can help your suppliers if they're, you know, if they're not technical, if they're a smaller supplier, or, you know, you can have renegotiations, if you will, about, you know, the risks that they pose to your business. But it's important to get it embedded into the process, and that way you can continually monitor them as well. And, you know, you're also always made aware of new companies that are coming on board, because how many times have we had a little company that's come on board and you don't know nothing about it because they may have slipped through the procurement process, whatever. But this way, they'll always be monitored.
Yep, great advice. So the next step is then, once you've sort of looked at continuous monitoring, is all sort of think about how you build this function within the organization. What we tend to see a lot is, you know, third-party risk is sort of, it's a sort of bit of an afterthought in some ways. We certainly have seen an increase in focus around this area because of GDPR, because it's a legal requirement now for all companies to understand and manage risk within cyber risk and privacy risk within their third-party supply chain. But it's also important to think about this as a function within an organization. Alan sort of touched on it. It's not just about technical vulnerabilities or finding things that you maybe weren't aware of and it highlights a risk area. It's also about things like contract management. You know, all of your third parties should have a contract in place which holds their feet to the fire, to so to speak, in terms of GDPR, data protection compliance. But it can also manage that risk, and as Alan says, you know, manage them from the point of view of managing the score, and saying that if the score falls below a certain level, then, you know, there needs to be a review carried out to some extent. And that puts a responsibility on them to also monitor that risk score. But there's obviously other things within a vendor risk management program that we're not going into a lot of detail today, but things like financial risk, financial management, any dispute governance, document management, multi-service integration. There's a whole bunch of things really there. How do they send up requests about what they're seeing in their risk profile, things like that. So again, there's a whole range of areas that you need to dig into, and you know, we'd be more than happy to come and chat to anybody about this and go into these in a lot more detail, and establish, you know, is there a gap in your current program against all of these different areas. Alan, any thoughts around this particular function within Pret? Yeah. How does that work?
Yeah, so the vendor relationship model is a shared services model, really. So they can see their own vulnerabilities and you can see them as well. So you can actually, as I've done, use that as leverage within contracts. It's a service you can offer your suppliers, because some of them will be smaller suppliers and they haven't got that functionality. So by giving them that service as well, you're keeping on top of it. They feel like you're giving them something back, and that's great. So we did, at the beginning of last year, we did an exercise, MTD, MTR. So mean time to detection, mean time to remediation exercise. And we had lots of questions, things like, if you got hacked, how long would it take to be picked up? Someone moving laterally across the network, etc. But one of the questions we used was, how long would it take us to address a supplier issue? So everyone on the webinar, if you think about a supplier you've got that handles personal data and they had a breach, if they had a breach, when would you know and when would they know? So if you can't say, you know, oh, I'm not sure, maybe I've got to wait for them to call me, or, you know, which is quite a common thing, RiskXchange will be, because of the continuous monitoring, it allows you to pick it up quite quickly. As a perfect example, last summer, we had a supplier that made a small change to their firewall, and overnight their score dropped dramatically. So I came in the next day, saw this alert, I was like, oh, wow. Contacted their security officer, who had no idea this change took place. And within an hour, it was fixed. So when we had a wash up afterwards, spoke to him, and he said, so it wasn't him, it was his party that looks after the firewall. So his third party, so our fourth party. And they had put an any rule in to troubleshoot an issue, connectivity issue, and they forgot to remove it. So any rule, what it does basically, it means anything can connect to anything from anything. So basically making the firewall transparent. So by seeing that alert, we've told them, he fixed it really quickly just by removing that rule. And to say he was, happy was an understatement. So that's a really good example of what happened.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's and that shows you the alerting's extremely important to, and keeping an eye on that score and the dashboards. So the other thing then you need to think about as part of your program, once you've carried out all the previous steps, is to make sure it's important to define process and reporting and produce MI. MI is critical to any VRM program. And in a lot of cases, we do see some level of programs in place, but they're not, there's not a good level of reporting for the board, as Alan's touched on, or there's weak process and in a lot of cases not documented process. So it's important to have clear process in terms of, how the third parties are monitored. If there's a breach on one of those third parties, how that's escalated. And in most cases, it should be incorporated into the overall organization breach response. But also it's important to report all of this up to the board. And a couple of other control points it's worth just highlighting here is that it's not just your third parties. It's important to look at the third parties' infrastructure providers, or maybe their cloud hosted SaaS applications. We see a lot of cloud-based or SaaS-based applications nowadays. And unfortunately, sometimes it can be hard to get some visibility into what their security controls look like. So again, RiskXchange can help you identify what they look like externally, as well as carry out monitoring of that on an ongoing basis. Any thoughts on this one, Alan?
Yeah, so I mean, as we said earlier, we use groups and tiered groups. So a good example of that is the marketing department may be the owners of the CRM relationship, but the CRM products may be in two groups. So it'll be in their group for marketing, and it'll be in the highly sensitive group, which gets closely monitored because that's going to have customer data in it, etc. And so you can then score that separately. So you can have an overall risk for all your sensitive data when you report to board, and then you can have individual teams, so for instance, marketing, HR, payroll, that have their own scores. So as soon as you report that up, that becomes very visible, and you can even game it, right? So, one team's better than the other team, they all want to be better. So how can we make it better? Right, well, let's talk to your suppliers.
So Alan, in respect to the group owners, have you found it difficult for the group owners to take ownership?
Well, the way we designed it is that the head of department or a senior member of staff are normally the responsibility owner, the relationship owner, if you will, because they sign the contract, right? So they have overall responsibility. And they have a good understanding of security. They want to be responsible and they want to protect the brand. So that drives them a lot to push their suppliers to be more secure. And I often have meetings with the heads as well of the relationships, just to say how they're getting on, and they just want a 10-minute chat about their suppliers, and that's great.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear. So the next thing then is really it's not, we sort of touched on there about reporting internally and up to the board and making sure there's good process within the business or within the organization. But it's critically important to have clear communication and tracking between the organization and your third parties, and in some cases fourth parties, because collaboration is the key really here. You can certainly monitor companies on RiskXchange and highlight any risks and track their score and what have you, but it's really it's really wasted, that information, unless you're working closely with the third parties and collaborating. And in a lot of cases, these third parties aren't aware of some of the issues. Like Alan's mentioned, the firewall issue, they weren't even aware of it. So it's really important to have strong collaboration and clear process in terms of monitoring and reporting. Alan, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so I mean, I use RiskXchange as a central point of contact as well, which is really good. So as I said before, we allow them to upload their processes and documents, but also RiskXchange, where they can upload their documents, they can actually upload their emergency contacts, their escalation process. And what that does, if anything does happen, for instance, the issue we had with the firewall, it stops all those emails firing around and people losing track of stuff. And, you know, I don't know who to ring. I'll email somebody who's on holiday. You know, it stops all of that. It allows a clear, concise piece of communication, and you can resolve an issue really quickly. You know, and I think, I mean, that's brilliant. It saves a load of spreadsheet going everywhere as well for your contacts.
Yeah, exactly. It's good to have all that information in one place, and you know, I guess the benefit of using RiskXchange for that is that you know, the third party sees exactly what you see, so you're not having to, you know, pull out the data and produce reports and send that on to them, which obviously requires a lot more time. So they're able to see that, and everyone's able to track it in real time and see any progress or mitigation controls being put in place.
That's right. It also allows us to easily audit it as well. So we can audit their processes, but it allows them to see our processes as well, which is a great collaborative piece.
Yeah, exactly. So the other area, and it's, as I said at the beginning of the call, it's an evolving area, and you know, traditionally most organizations sort of had enough on their plate in some ways to manage their third parties when it comes to risk. And sometimes that can be, as I said, it can be hundreds or thousands of vendors. But it's also important to think about fourth party risk nowadays, and in some cases, fifth party risk. It's important to ask your suppliers, you know, what do they do with that information you're sending to them? Do they send that out to a sub-processor or a subcontractor in some way? Does that fourth party have access to that data? These are key questions you should be asking your third parties to identify, I guess, your fourth parties as well. And then we would always recommend that as well as monitoring your third parties, you should be monitoring your fourth parties. And in some cases, we have seen companies on RiskXchange wanting to monitor their fifth parties as well, because you know, this data is being transferred all the way down through the supply chain and coming all the way back. And the beauty of RiskXchange, it allows you to see all of these parties clearly through a hierarchy sort of view of it, and you're able to then see the risk score of everyone and look at things like aggregated risk as well as systemic risk, potential systemic risk issues within your supply chain as well. And I think also that type of information can help feed into your disaster recovery as well. Alan, any thoughts around this one?
Yeah, so okay, so let's say that when we're looking at fourth parties, so imagine, I mean, a lot of companies use things like Jira, Confluence. So imagine that you've got a third party that's developing a website for you, and they're using their ticketing system, Jira, and all the documentations on Confluence, and one of those or both get breached. Now, you're at risk of your PII becoming, or your IP becoming, you know, at risk, but also they could be doing other stuff for you as well, or other third parties, say for instance, our CRM provider could also be using Jira. So it allows you to see the shared services that your fourth parties are using, you know, and I mean, that is great. I mean, so you know, I mean, you know your third parties and your fourth parties and who they're sharing data with. But what about if they become breached? You know, what's it going to affect? So one breach could affect loads. Imagine if Office 365 became breached. How much would you know, all those third parties that use Office 365, you know, all your emails are going to become, you know, available. You know, you never know, right? So it's a really important thing to be able to monitor constantly.
Yeah, it's a key one, and certainly the data in RiskXchange shows that there's a lot of dependency, you know, interdependency among thousands or hundreds of thousands of companies, for example, within financial services or retail. You know, so you know, it's you know, companies rely on other companies. It's sort of stating the obvious, but it's interesting when you start to look at the dependencies, the dependency hosting providers, the dependency application providers. And obviously the big ones you've mentioned, like Office 365, but also, you know, companies like Amazon, AWS. If any of those fourth parties, you know, or have an issue, then that's going to impact all of your third parties and bring down your whole supply chain. So it's important to look at these things. And I think, when it comes to the big companies, you've got some, I guess, confidence in that they will manage and maintain availability and security and what have you. But the ones to look out for are the smaller providers, where we see smaller hosting providers that maybe don't have, the right disaster recovery and plans in place or resilient infrastructure. So again, RiskXchange will help you highlight those and let you manage risk around those as well. So starting to wrap up now, we sort of touched on this point a few times, and there's a lot of elements you have to build out and design and implement for a good vendor risk management program. But one of the most critical pieces here is leveraging contracts. It's great getting technical data and risk data from RiskXchange and other tools, but it's also important to make sure that you have some backup in terms of the contracts. And as Alan said earlier, you can write the risk score requirement into the contracts, and this is a great way to do that. But it's also a great way to push down some of that accountability into the fourth and fifth parties within a supply chain. You can make your third parties accountable, but insist that they pass those terms down into their third parties, effectively your fourth parties. So again, contracts are important. It's not something that should be left off, and there shouldn't be, all of the focus shouldn't go into sort of operational issues. It's important to look at the contracts as well. And it's important to define which services these companies are allowed to provide for you. These things are critical or a requirement, I guess, when it comes to GDPR. So again, if you're required to be compliant with GDPR, which I think most organizations are, then it's important to look at your contracts and try and write in maybe the risk score into that particular contract. Any thoughts on that, Alan?
Yeah, so leveraging contracts is great. As soon as you've got this kind of thing in the procurement process, it becomes just a normal part of day-to-day life. And so one thing we did do is obviously put in the scores, the minimum score they can have into the contract was, for instance, for developers that will be developing code, clauses in the contract so they agree not to deliver code that's vulnerable to the OWASP top 10. And when it does become vulnerable to the OWASP top 10, they need to correct it. So for instance, it's lovely today, next month, all of a sudden that code become vulnerable and it's up to them to fix it, But, how many times have you had a developer that's gone, oh, okay, well, now we need to fix that code. It's going to cost you some development time. But if it's in the contracts, that's great. And that's where the continual monitoring helps as well. To be fair, I do love the continual monitoring. It allows me to make sure everyone's doing the best they can at the time. And they're quite aware of that as well. So if they make sure they don't want Pret to be calling them.
No, it's good, and we do see that that's quite a common thing. We see a lot of applications being pushed onto live effectively, and there's in a lot of cases there's misconfigurations in the applications that RiskXchange have picked up, as well as as you touched on there, not meeting all of the OWASP security requirements, and really it's a fundamental thing nowadays that companies. Our applications should meet all of these requirements. There's really no excuse anymore. So just to wrap up then, so we covered a lot of different areas, and unfortunately we are sort of restricted to time. But as I said earlier, we would be more than happy to come along and dig into any of these details in a bit more detail in a face-to-face meeting or a video conference meeting if that suited better. And we can, go step you through each of these stages, understand where you are today, and understand how we can help you address any gaps that you may have. But RiskXchange is a platform, as Alan's mentioned a few times now, which it allows you to do this continuous monitoring, which is really important. And the days of sending out an assessment and waiting for it to come back is really behind us now, and you need to look at risk on a continuous basis. So again, there's a number of features which I'm not going to go into in this call with RiskXchange, but we're more than happy to follow up with a demo. We'll also make this presentation available through sending out an email afterwards. If anybody wants a copy of it, they can let us know. So I think we'll just close out now, move on to anybody with any questions. Ange?
Thank you very much, Darren. Yes, we have a couple of questions for Alan.
Okay.
Right. So you spoke earlier about the custom questionnaire. What was the process to implement that?
Okay, so I mean, I said earlier on I had that questionnaire I'd been using for quite a while, where I'd refined the questions, and so what we did, I brought the questionnaire over and we went through each of the questions, and then we weighted the questions, and that's the key part. You can then break them down and say, right, so these questions will only need to be asked to people that supply HR services, and these people that give us payroll services, for instance. So the questions can be slightly different, because you don't want to be sending a questionnaire to a company that just fits locks, for instance, on your doors. You know, you don't want to send them a whole graphic questionnaire. You may need to send them 3 or 4 questions. You know, how do you secure the sending of the passcodes for the safes, for instance, in all our shops? How, that kind of question. So the question is key, because then it allows you to, you know, get a good risk score against something.
Great, thanks, Alan. And one other question for you. How long did it take to implement RiskXchange and the process?
So it didn't take that long, actually. First of all, we've done all our audits, so we know all our suppliers and all our third parties. So then we uploaded them all. We made sure that we've done a few tests with the questionnaires. We got the template right. So when you add them company to RiskXchange, they're fired a template, and that invite basically, it tells them to, you know, I've sent them an invite, they come in, they click the link, they start filling the questionnaire, which is great. And when they get there, they've already got their site, if you will, that's been gathered from all open source data, things like Showdown, etc. So they can see their scores and they can answer their questions. And I mean, you know, I mean, I suppose how many third parties you're going to have. I mean, if we started off with all, say, I don't know, 100, for instance, it may have taken a bit longer, but, you know, 2 or 3 weeks max, you know, and then you've got a good supply. You can report on scores, you've got questionnaires answered, you know, yeah, it's really good.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, Darren. Great. Thank you all very much for attending the webinar. And the slides will be provided to the attendees, and the recording will also be available. So thank you very much.
Sorry, Ange, one last thing. Just I've seen a question come in there, and it's can we get access to our scores to see how our suppliers look? So again, that's a facility we can make available to anybody on the call. Maybe if they're not interested necessarily in their own risk score, but they're interested to see how a couple of their suppliers look. So we're more than happy to provide that information after the call if somebody wants that. And you know, we can provide that in a trial as well, to give you a chance to play around with the software and see what you think.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I mean, I personally, once you get on the RiskXchange platform, start adding your third parties. You can see their scores, and then you can just remove them. You know, it takes minutes.
Darren, we've just had another question come in. Can we do a score on North Door?
So that score is already available to everyone within the RiskXchange platform, and it's available to anyone that wants to look at it. So again, it's just a matter of signing up for a trial, and you can get that information.
Great. Thank you very much, Darren.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay,
Thanks,
I think that wraps up. That's great. Thank you all very much for attending.
Bye.
Bye now.